So as mentioned, my name is Sarah, and I'm going to be presenting on the Cultural Forms in Transit course thread, and the title of my presentation is Assigning and Assessing Value. The agenda for my presentation is I'm just going to tell a little bit about me and sort of how I found my way to this course thread, talk about the classes I took, talk about sort of one of the big ideas that I took away from those classes and where it's led me. So a little bit about me. I'm originally from Minnesota, and I have a really strong connection with my background from Minnesota. I obviously go to school in California, but I move between the two very frequently. And I feel like my identity is strongly rooted in being from Minnesota. I also travel a lot, and I come from two households that I moved between as a child. So this idea of like transit and motion resonates with me in a lot of different ways. So the three classes that I took to complete this course thread are African American Studies 142 AC, Race in American Film, Ethnic Studies 176, Ethnic Art and Artists, and Ethnic Studies 101B, Humanities, Methods, and Ethnic Studies. And they're all great courses, and something that kind of wasn't apparent to me initially, but I've sort of come to reflect on, especially after talking to Mary, is that they all have to do with art. And I think that that was subconsciously intentional for me, because that's something that is important to me, and I think that art has a lot of power as well. And so you'll see the images on the screen. The movie poster of Do the Right Thing was one of the films that we watched in the Race in American Film class, and we looked at a history of film starting with D.W. Griffin's Do the Right Thing, or not Do the Right Thing, D.W. Griffin's, I'm blanking on the title now. Birth of a Nation, thank you. All the way up to a contemporary examples like Do the Right Thing. And we were looking at the role that race plays in that, and how film as a cultural element can be really influential in changing our opinions about race. The second image is two images of a project that I worked on for Ethnic Art and Artists at the Ethnic Studies course. I looked at freight train graffiti and sort of did my own rendition. So the top image is the actual artist's graffiti, and then the bottom is my sort of interpretation. And I looked at graffiti by artists from different states and how that moved across state lines on the freight trains that travel the transnational or the national railroads. And then the last image is the book cover of Jeff Chang's new book, Who We Be, The Colorization of America, which we're currently reading, or just finished reading, in my Ethnic Studies, Humanities, Methods class. And it talks a lot about culture as a tool and as sort of a precursor to political change, cultural change. So cultural forms in transit, and as I mentioned before, the transit aspect of this really stood out to me, and kind of tying in with the title of my presentation, the idea that we always need to assess value of cultural forms because they're constantly in transit, and different value is constantly being assigned to different cultural forms because they're in transit. So depending which cultures are receiving them, who within the cultures is evaluating them, what the political climate is like at the time changes how we look at those cultural forms. And so this idea of transit, or this idea of motion, I think came across in all of the courses that I took for this course thread. So we have the idea of the moving picture, and this was one of the early examples of the moving picture, was the horse running by Edward Muybridge. And one of the things that Professor Cohen, who teaches the Race in American Film course, talked about was that films are not about the time period they present, but they're about the time period in which they are made. And that has stuck with me for the past couple of years. And I think that that's really relevant in thinking about how cultural forms, even if you're doing a historical piece and trying to depict a different time period, the themes and what the audience is going to remember about your in this case film, your artwork, will be really representative of the time in which it was made. Then motion, in specifically the project that I worked on in the ethnic art and artist course, talking about freight train graffiti. So the motion of the train from one state to another carries the artist graffiti with it, carries the artist intention, carries the artist's culture, and how that's perceived in different states who maybe don't have the same kind of cultural competency, I think is really relevant. And then other things that we talked about in that ethnic art and artist class is how art and culture is often an intervention, and it often occurs where the political reign can neither resolve nor suppress inequality. And art is that which moves and which compels movement. And I think that in all three of these courses, that idea has been very strong. And then for this last course, this is the image of the Great Wave by Katsushika Hokusai. It's a famous Japanese wood print. And Jeff Chang talks about culture like a wave. And he says in his book, "A wave is not only an event, it is a motion, a process. It is the process of forces generated in the Arctic to the Antarctic, rolling from the bottom of the ocean for hundreds of miles until they gather and hit these shallow reefs. Then boom, the famous waves that pipe or chops. So a wave is an event, but it is also a process, the movement of forces, some visible above the surface, much of it unseen, rising from the bottom up." And I think that if we think about that movement of a wave in relation to culture, it seems to fit very well. That culture can be an event. It can be, Shepard Fairey's image of Obama in the red, white, and blue that was so prevalent during the 2008 election. It can be, a performance that you go and see, some other kind of cultural event. But culture is also things rolling beneath the surface, whether it's artists that are working on things, whether it's, people that are engaged in organizing and activism or community building. Those all have to do with culture, and they're all constant processes that are ongoing. So where it's moved me, I, as was said before, I'm an ethnic studies major who's graduating in a few weeks, and I'm just finishing up my thesis in ethnic studies. I'm writing about how NBA players have struggled against the NBA dress code that was instated in 2005, and there was a lot of criticism at the time that the dress code was created because a lot of players and critics felt that it targeted black players and black players' apparel unfairly. And since I've been looking at since then how different players have sort of changed their style choices and asking the question of has this given them more agency and allowed them to sort of create a new culture for themselves, or how much are they still sort of restrained by these imposed rules that the NBA has set upon them. And sort of to conclude, we have this image of different, to kind of go with the rail theme from before, different railroad lines. So the idea that culture is constantly in motion, but a switch can be triggered and can completely go down a different track. Art is really an important part of culture. It's definitely not the only part, but you can't really have culture without some kind of art. And looking at culture as a contemporary repository of memory and history, and not just something that is occurring in the time that it's happening. And so just kind of restating the fact that we constantly need to be assessing and reassigning value to things as our culture shifts, and we see this happening every day. It doesn't have to be a scholarly activity, but it's really important. And I think that as I'm preparing to graduate in a few days, this idea of motion is constantly in my mind and kind of moving forward. And so I think that if we not only apply that to culture, but to our lives, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Any questions?
I have more of a comment.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of these talks are about cultural forms in transit, right? Whether it's a human rights concept or health concept or design, right? And thinking about how do we assess value in different contexts.
Oh, yeah.
No, Rebecca, go ahead.
Rebecca had a question.
No, but I think that, I guess, so if you trace sort of the trajectory of photos from like early beginning into sort of the modern day film, I forgot the name of the film
Mhm.
you said, but sort of looking at the sort of the blatant, we're going to use blackface and we're going to, have a black man rape a white woman, that whole thing, and to make it less apparent, to make it more hidden. What do you think that sort of means, and do you think that's what the situation is? Those are the two questions.
I think that it makes it, I think that the kind of the example of film can be applied to sort of broader society as well. So, we used to have movies where, like you said, people were in blackface, things that were blatantly racist were presented on the screen to audiences. We know where we used to also have slavery that was legal, and we had legal segregation, things that were, blatantly disenfranchising people. Whereas now we've moved to a system and, films where it's more hidden, it's more under the surface. We have institutionalized problems, we have structural problems that still perpetuate the same kind of racism and inequality. And then within films, there'll be like token characters, or there'll be stereotypes of characters that are presented in different films. I don't think that it makes it, I think that you can't argue that there haven't been improvements, because I think that there have been, but I think that the way that racism or disenfranchisement is presenting itself now is difficult to tackle, because it means more dismantling of a bigger system that I think people in power are less comfortable with acquiescing than they would to change certain like specific laws, like a Voter Rights Act or something like that. I don't really have like a solid answer, but I think that it makes it, people need to be more critical to recognize those things, because I think there would be a lot of people who would just say, well, look, now there's, not blatant racism in movies and everything's okay, when that's not the case. Yeah.
I'm very curious to know what you found out about in your MBA study, and how you kind of separate cultural trends in fashion from the NBA trends in fashion. So some of the things that in that picture of where LeBron was wearing, kind of tuxedo, like kind of throwback rat look, from the 50s or 60s. How much of that how much of that in your paper has to do with kind of cultural changes in just general kind of fashion culture, and then how much is specifically, do you think, related to the 2005 NBA rules?
Yeah, that's the tricky part is, I haven't gotten the chance to interview NBA players or kind of ask their intentions behind what they're wearing. And that is the tricky part, because the culture in general has changed. Hip hop, which was a big influence of NBA style pre-2005 and still has changed a lot. And so it's easy to kind of track the parallels between, but it's hard to place causation on one or the other. So that's something that I kind of, one of the limitations of my paper is it's difficult to kind of track that. But I think that there have been like really clear changes that in the photos that I illustrated, it's two players who started just a few years before the league instated the dress code, and they were wearing what one would consider kind of like a classic NBA or classic rap, like hip hop outfit. And now, they're both considered fashion moguls. They have their own lines. They're, modeling. They're doing events at New York Fashion Week. And so what I'm trying to argue is that these players are kind of embracing, whether it's the culture kind of moving forward or whether it's them kind of pushing the culture, they're embracing it and being able to have positive gains from it, while kind of struggling with this racially charged dress code. Yeah. All right, thanks.